Part 2. May 2nd, 2008, 6:36 p.m. What did you do? Chapter 6. When I opened my eyes again, I was actually surprised to find that I wasn't still asleep in my own bed, waking to start a new school day. That's the way it was supposed to work, right? Nick was supposed to call, and I was supposed to go on to school, hating every minute of it, worrying that he and Jeremy were at Blue Lake doing God knows what, and agonizing that Nick was going to break up with me, and getting pestered by Christy Bruder on the bus. I was supposed to wake up, and the scraps that I could remember about Nick shooting up the Commons were supposed to be a dream, drifting away before I could even drum up the images fully in my awakened mind. I woke up in the hospital. There were police in my room, and the TV was turned on to a crime scene. Their backs were turned to me, their faces tilted up toward the TV screen. I squinted at the TV where images of a parking lot, a brick building, a football field, all vaguely familiar, blipped on and off of the screen. I shut my eyes again. I felt groggy. My eyes were very dry, and my leg throbbed, and I started to remember not exactly what happened, but that something really bad had happened. "She's waking up," I heard. I recognized the voice as Frankie's, but I hadn't seen him when I'd opened my eyes before, and it seemed easier to just imagine him standing next to the bed, saying that, than to try to see him. So I let myself drift into this imaginary world where Frankie was standing nearby saying, "She's waking up," and it was true. But I wasn't at the hospital, and my leg didn't hurt. "I'll go find a nurse," another voice said. My dad's. That one was easy. The voice was tense, strained, terse. Just like Dad. He popped into my imaginary scene as well in the background, floating out of view. He was tapping something into his PDA, and he had a cell phone between his ear and his shoulder. He popped out just as quickly, and it was just Frankie looking at me again. "Val?" Frankie said. "Hey, Val. You awake?" The vision morphed into a morning in my bedroom. Frankie trying to wake me up to do something fun like in the old days when Mom and Dad got along and we were just two little kids. Find our Easter baskets maybe, or a Christmas present, or pancakes. I liked this place. I really did. So I have no idea why my eyes fluttered open again. They did it without my consent. They opened onto Frankie, standing at the end of my bed by my toes. Only it wasn't my bed, but a strange one with crisp, scratchy white sheets and a brown blanket that looked like oatmeal. His hair was completely limp, and I had a minute of trying to clear my head because I honestly couldn't remember the last time I saw Frankie with limp hair. I had a hard time matching the 14-year-old Frankie face to the 11-year-old Frankie hair. I had to blink several times before I could make sense of it. "Frankie?" I said. But before I could say anything else, my attention was distracted to a wet sort of sniffling to my right. I turned my head slowly. My mom was there, sitting in a pink upholstered chair. Her legs were crossed at the knees, and she had one elbow propped on top of them. In that hand she held a crumpled up tissue she kept using to dab her nose. I squinted at her. I somehow wasn't surprised that she was crying because I knew that whatever the bad thing was that had happened, I was involved in it, even though I hadn't yet put together why I was waking up in what was beginning to look like a hospital bed rather than in my own bed waiting for Nick to call. I reached out and placed my hand on Mom's wrist, the one holding the snotty tissue. "Mom?" I whispered. My throat hurt. "Mom," I said again. But she leaned away from me. Not jerked away. It was way too subtle of a movement to be considered a jerk, but more leaned away, out of my grasp. Leaned away like she was physically separating herself from me. Leaned away, not like I was to be feared, but like she no longer wanted to be identified with me at all. "You're awake," she said. "How do you feel?" I looked down myself and wondered why I wouldn't feel okay. I checked myself out, and everything seemed to be there, including several wires that weren't normally a part of my body. I still wasn't sure why I was there, but I knew it had to be something I was going to live through. I'd somehow hurt my leg. That much I could glean from the dull throbbing under the sheet. Yet the legs still seemed to be there, so I knew there wasn't too much to be worried about. "Mom?" I said one more time, wishing I could think of something else to say, something more important. My throat was achy and felt swollen. I tried clearing it, but found it was dry too, and all I could do was make a squeaky little noise that did nothing to help it. What happened? A nurse in pink scrubs fluttering around behind Mom moved to a little table and picked up a plastic cup with a straw hanging over the side of it. She handed it to Mom. Mom held it, looked at it like she'd never seen such a contraption before, and then looked over her shoulder at one of the police officers, who had turned away from the TV and was staring down at me, his fingers hooked into his belt. "You were shot," the officer said plainly from over Mom's shoulder, and I saw Mom kind of wince when he said it, although she was still facing him, not me, and I couldn't see her face exactly. "Nick LaVille shot you." I frowned. "Nick LaVille shot me?" "But that's my boyfriend's name," I said. Later, I would realize how stupid I sounded and would even be a little bit embarrassed by it. But at the time, it just didn't make sense, mostly because I hadn't put it all together yet, and because I was just coming out of the anesthesia, and probably even a little bit because my brain didn't want me to remember everything right away. Once, I saw a documentary about different things the brain will do to protect itself, like when a kid who's abused ends up with multiple personalities and stuff. I think my brain was doing that to me, protecting me, but it didn't do it for very long. Not long enough, anyway. The officer nodded at me, like he already knew this about Nick and I wasn't giving him any new information, and Mom turned around again and kind of looked down at the sheets. I scanned their faces, all of them. Mom's, the officers, the nurses, Frankie's, even Dad's. I hadn't seen him pop back into the room, but there he was standing by the window, his arms folded across his chest. But none of them were looking directly at me. Not a good sign. "What's going on?" I asked. "Frankie?" Frankie didn't say anything, just clenched his jaw in his pissed-off pose and shook his head. His face was getting really red. "Valerie, do you remember anything about school today?" Mom asked quietly. I won't say she asked it gently or tenderly or any of that motherly stuff, because she didn't. She asked it to the sheets in a low voice, a flat voice I barely recognized. "School?" And then things started flooding in on me. Funny, because when I first started waking up, what happened at school felt like a dream, and I thought, surely they aren't talking about that, because that was just some stupid, horrible dream. But within a few seconds, the realization that it wasn't a dream sunk in on me, and I almost felt physically squashed between the images. "Valerie, something terrible happened at school today. Do you remember it?" Mom asked. I couldn't answer her. I couldn't answer anyone. I couldn't say anything. All I could do was stare at the TV screen, at the aerial view of Garvin High and all the ambulances and cop cars surrounding it. Stare at it until I swear I could see the individual little squares of color on the screen. Mom's voice was far away, and I could hear her, but it wasn't like she was talking to me exactly. Not in my world. Not under this avalanche of horrible. I was alone here. "Valerie, I'm talking to you. Nurse, is she okay? Valerie, can you hear me? Jesus, Ted, do something." And then my dad's voice. "What do you want me to do, Jenny?" "What do I do?" "More than just stand there. This is your family, Ted. For Christ's sake, your daughter. Valerie, answer me. Val?" But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the TV screen, which I saw, and didn't see at the same time. Nick. He shot people. He shot Christy Bruder, Mr. Klein. Oh God, he shot them. He really did it. I saw it, and he shot them. He shot... I reached down and felt the bandages wrapped around my thigh. And then I started to cry. Not loud crying or anything like that, but shoulder-twitching, lip-curling crying. The kind I once heard Oprah call the ugly cry. Mom jumped up from her chair, leaning over me, but she wasn't talking to me. "Nurse, I think she's in pain. I think you need to do something for her pain. Ted, make them do something for her pain." and I noticed, only barely and through a gauzy sort of wonderment, that she was crying too, crying so that her commands took on this frantic sort of gruffness, so that her words were hitched and desperate. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Dad come up behind her and grab her by the shoulders and pull her away from the bed. She went reluctantly, but she did go, and she turned her face into Dad's chest, and they both walked out of the room. I could hear her harsh barks recede down the hall. The nurse was pushing buttons on some monitor behind me, and the cop had turned and was watching TV again. Frankie stood staring at my blankets, motionless. I cried until my stomach hurt, and I was pretty sure I was going to throw up. My eyes felt sandy, and my nose was completely plugged up. I cried a little bit after that even. I can't say what was going through my mind with all that crying, only that it was murky and dark and hateful and woeful and miserable all at once. Only that I wanted Nick, and I wanted to never see him again. Only that I wanted my mom, and that I wanted to never see her again either. Only that I knew, somewhere back there in the recesses, that my brain was keeping safe from itself, that in some way I was responsible for what had happened today too, that I had a part in it and that I never meant to, and that I couldn't say for sure I wouldn't have been part of it if I had to do it all over again. And I couldn't say for sure that I would. Eventually, the crying slowed enough so that I could breathe again, which wasn't altogether good. "I'm going to throw up," I said. The nurse produced a bedpan from out of nowhere and stuffed it under my chin. I heaved into it. "If you'll step out for just a few minutes," she told the officers. They nodded and silently left the room. When they opened the door, I could hear muffled talking and voices that belonged to my parents out in the hallway. Frankie stayed put. I heaved again, making ugly noises and letting my nose run in snotty ropes into the bedpan. I caught my breath, and the nurse used a wet washcloth to wipe my face clean. It felt good, cold, soothing. I closed my eyes and rested my head back on the pillow. "Nausea is normal after anesthesia," the nurse told me in a voice I can best describe as institutional. "It will subside with time. In the meantime, keep this close." She handed me a clean bedpan, folded the washcloth, and laid it across my forehead, then left the room on her silent shoes. I tried to blank my mind, tried to make myself turn those images in my mind black, but I couldn't do it. They shoved in on me, each one more horrible than the one before. "Is he in jail?" I asked Frankie. Stupid question. Of course Nick would be in jail after something like this. Frankie looked up at me, kind of startled, like he'd forgotten I was in the room with him. "Valerie," he said, blinking, shaking his head, his voice husky. What did you do?" "Is Nick in jail?" I repeated. He shook his head no. "He got away?" I asked. Again, he shook his head. I knew that left only one other option. "They shot him?" I said this more as a statement than a question, and was surprised when Frankie again shook his head no. "He shot himself," he said. "He's dead."